Hello, good afternoon, everybody. We are live. So we have the pleasure today talking about a subject that has been creating some quite lively discussions, which is what about the countries joining the EU and what is happening when a country joins the EU in terms of the freedom, the EU regulations it has to adapt before joining. Does freedom increases or not? And there is some discussion being on for some time now, and ΚΕΦίΜ decided to measure, to put some evidence on the discussion. And today we are going to talk with evidence about the freedom, if it comes with enlarging the EU when a country joins the EU or not. And so we have some very special panelists you are going to meet, and they are going to enlighten us with their wisdom. And let's start by just a few remarks from Alexandros Skouras, President of ΚΕΦίΜ. Good afternoon, Alexandre.
Thank you, Effie, and welcome everybody to this very important event. First of all, I want to thank the European Liberal Forum for having the vision to support this project and this very important research, an empirical study that was done by a group of very talented and important economists. I just want to share a few words about why at ΚΕΦίΜ we looked at this very important study. Over the years, I have been troubled by something that has been going on in Brussels, and that's the adoption of the free market agenda by a very large portion of Eurosceptics who actually, share very little with us liberals on many other topics. And I realized that on the one hand, liberals need to be more outspoken about these issues, about the issue of economic freedom. And on the other hand, we need to reclaim the notion of a free and functioning economy back into the liberal fold. One of the main criticisms that Eurosceptics used to bring against the European Union is that due to its nature, it's very centralized and it imposes unnecessary bureaucratic burdens on its member states. However, they always brought these up with no regard to the four basic freedoms that all members of the European Union enjoy. But also there was an untold story of the reforms and the improvements on both the economy and the rule of law, which is very important for a free market to operate, that each country need to undergo during their accession period. That's what brought the birth to this question. And this is what my colleagues and our friends from Centro Einaudi in Italy and the European Liberal Forum tried to answer with this study. I hope you all enjoy a very lively discussion. I see that there's an amazing panel here for all of you. And be sure that as soon as I log out from this Zoom call, I'm going to tune in and enjoy the conversation. So thank you, Effie, for hosting, and thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you, Alexandre. And before giving the floor to Daniel Kaddik, the Executive Director of the European Liberal Forum, I would very much like any of you that have any question or want to ask anything, comment on anything, please use the chat here on Zoom. Our event is also live on Facebook on ΚΕΦίΜ's page, so you can also use the comment section there. And at the end of our discussion, we will take all your comments and questions and our panelists will try to respond to them the best they can. So Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Effie. Thank you very much, ΚΕΦίΜ. Thank you very much, Centro Einaudi, for being with us today as partners and bringing forward this fantastic publication that couldn't be more timely, as Alexander Skouras already has mentioned. We as the European Liberal Forum, the foundation of the European liberals and the think tank of the European liberals, bring together now 47 member organizations like ΚΕΦίΜ, like Centro Einaudi from all over Europe to get together to work jointly on the liberal future in a united Europe. And even though a lot of people don't seem to connect it anymore, but one of the key aspects of European peace is the economic stability and the economic progress of Europe. And as we look back, the promise of more economic freedom and more prosperity was one of the key drivers for new countries to join the European Union, both in the big wave with 7 new members and the smaller accession waves after. And there seems to be a lot of anecdotal evidence that the increase of economic freedom and economic performance in Eastern Europe is connected to the accession and the pre-accession. Indeed, it seems like a no-brainer to talk about that. The market access, the good kind of antitrust rules, meaning that the state would get out of the way of free enterprise to flourish, a freedom to trade, rule of law, reliable rules and reliable application of these rules seem to indeed foster economic growth, economic prosperity, and economic freedom. But where are we going with this? Is that really the case, or has that been anecdotal evidence? And I'm very glad that we have this publication to shed some light on that, both in the case of Italy and the case of Greece, and we can extrapolate the findings there also to the new accession countries. And I hope also have some lessons both for a potential new accession for the European Union, but also for the countries that are already there, so we don't have a rollback. And having said that, again, thank you very much, ΚΕΦίΜ, thank you very much, Centro Einaudi, thank you very much to the distinguished panel, and especially also the author of today's discussion. We would be anything without our members, so please keep up the good work, keep up the good fight. And again, we stand for a liberal future in a united Europe, and that is only possible with discussion like today. Thank you, and back to you, Effie.
Thank you, Daniel. So let's get into it with Emmanuel Schizas, who is the lead researcher and the main author of this report. And Manos is also is the lead in regulation and regulatory technology at the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance. And he is also an expert in regulatory reform. He has previously served as a regulator with the UK's Financial Conduct Authority and as a subject matter expert on regulatory reform on the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. And also Manos has written extensively on the subject of regulatory reform. So I think he's and is the author of the report. So Manos, the floor is yours to present us the main findings. What did you measure?
Thank you very much, Effie, and thanks very much to the ELF for its support. As Effie already said, I'm Emmanuel Schizas. I'm a member of ΚΕΦίΜ's scientific committee. I'm one of 3 authors of today's study. I'm the least photogenic of them, but there you go. That's your luck today. Many thanks to my co-authors Mara Vidali and Kostas Saravakos, who may be able to join us in Q&As later on. The topic has already been quite well introduced. We're here to discuss whether EU accession has anything to do with increasing or decreasing economic freedom. I'll try not to revisit too much of what was said already, but it's fair to say now is a particularly good time to be having this conversation on the basis of evidence. This is a period of introspection. We've had one final wave of enlargement ahead of, first of all, the global financial crisis, then the Eurozone debt crisis, and then indeed Brexit, all of which kind of shook the EU institutions to their core, not just by challenging member state sovereignty and also paradoxically increasing government as a share of shrinking economies, but also giving Eurosceptics the ability to draw, with some success, I feel, on liberal and libertarian arguments in this area. But from a purely academic perspective, there is also a gap in terms of the evidence we have or have had today to bring to this debate. So there's actually quite a few studies that point in broad terms to the EU's pro-market influence, and even some quantitative ones. But so far, most of the effects people have found have been hard to attribute directly to the process of accession. And it's also fair to say that we have a lot more pre-crisis than post-crisis data in the existing literature. So it makes sense to revisit this discussion now with a richer data set and a fresh pair of eyes. So what is it, strictly speaking, that we are testing? Well, first of all, we want to know whether the degree of economic freedom in a particular jurisdiction is correlated with that country's process through the EU accession pipeline, through the specific milestones of EU accessions, and also, to the extent that we can, what exactly are the channels through which this this progression happens. I'm informed that there's limited visibility to the slideshow. Can everyone see my slides correctly? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I do apologize to the people having technical problems. Please bear with us. Now, before we launch into the findings, there's a little bit of necessary prep work. First of all, we need to get our concepts as clearly laid out as possible so that we can all be discussing the same things. Economic freedom in particular is a multifaceted concept. It's very hard to quantify, very hard to pin down. To get anywhere in this debate and to make it as empirical as possible, we are forced to use quantitative proxies, things like the Economic Freedom of the World Index of the Fraser Institute, which is the one we're using here, or the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, or Freedom House's Index. All of these have their limitations. No one is perfect. What we have found in using the Economic Freedom of the World Index is that it offers certain characteristics that are useful for this study. So there's very good time series coverage, so we can cover multiple episodes of EU enlargement. There's a significant hard data component, so that we can be assured that we're not unduly swayed by expert opinion or by survey-driven opinions. And the fact that it's a non-weighted index is also quite helpful to us because it means very few assumptions go into the calculation of the index at top level. As a reminder of what exactly the Economic Freedom of the World Index measures, I've got to the right of this screen the kind of 5 domains across which the index measures freedom, so size of government, legal system, protection of property rights, sound money and curtailing kind of inflationary tendencies, freedom to trade, and of course, better regulation. Now, really importantly, one of the things we've decided to do is, instead of look at scores in their absolute form, we followed the methodological choices of people such as the World Bank and used a distance to frontier measure. So throughout this presentation and indeed the study, you won't hear us talking about economic freedom scores so much as a freedom gap. The way we define that is each country's distance in freedom score from the best performer in the index or the sub-index of that very year. So this is a more robust measure. It's more robust to changes in methodology. It also better accounts or manages to kind of tease out the effect of a global kind of increase in the economic liberty, so that we're not conflating the influence of the EU with other factors. So we find that a much more helpful dependent variable to work with. Having said that, this choice has not really affected results. Everything you'll see now, we have rerun with just the raw scores as our dependent. The difference is not huge. And of course, there's also the question of how to conceptualize EU accession, because that's also a multidimensional process. So there's a candidacy and accession process set out in what are known as the Copenhagen criteria. Each country progresses from applicant status to candidate through to negotiation to membership. And the way they do that, as you already heard, is by, first of all, demonstrating alignment to core values and compatibility with the EU institutions, but also also onboarding the acquis, so a significant amount of EU legislation and regulations, which include components that are strongly, explicitly pro-market and pro-competition. And in our analysis, what we've decided to do, because there's many ways of conceptualizing this, is to design a simple EU proximity variable that effectively distinguishes between the non-member, the candidate, and the full member. So you can see a linear progression there. Of course, there are assumptions included in designing the variable this way. We can discuss them later on, but that's the most useful way we could think of to conceptualize this concept. Bear in mind, of course, because we're dealing with freedom gaps as our dependent variable, what you will see in the results of this study is when you see negative coefficients, that means closing the gap. That's good if you're interested in kind of promoting economic freedom. So I'll remind you of this later on when we come to the actual numbers. Now, what exactly did we do? We used Economic Freedom of the World index and sub-index data for 46 countries over 18 years. That's 2000 to 2017. For each of these tables of index and sub-index scores, we calculated distance to frontier scores, so freedom gaps for each country, so how far away they were from the leader in that category. And we divided our sample of country year observations into EU member states, EU candidate countries, and OECD countries that have never been and will not be, by the looks of it, EU countries. Now, this is really important. The choice of comparators that we've made is, to me, a defining characteristic of this study. It's one thing to compare countries from the EU periphery before and after accession, where you're really comparing poorer countries with more developed countries. And it's another thing to compare EU countries with their OECD counterparts who are not in the EU and are very often wealthy countries, so the likes of the US and Canada, which have no need and no intention to join the EU. So this is just to clarify that we're not giving ourselves an easy hurdle here to clear for a pro-liberal effect of EU membership. And bearing in mind that no data set or index is perfect, and there are significant kind of autocorrelations and heteroscedasticity issues with data such as that, we've designed our study as a standard panel regression model, with standard errors clustered at country level. And we've run two different types of regressions. So one involves fixed effects, the other involves a two-stage least squares model. In all cases, we've assumed linear relationships. And just to make sure that we're not that we're not being tricked by reverse causality. So, for instance, economic freedom being a cause of EU accession and not vice versa, we've introduced a number of instrumental variables, which I'll explain later. All of this, to cut a long story short, is to say that we're aware that no data set is perfect. And we're trying to the extent possible to get to the point where we can clear away confounders and issues in the data itself. That still doesn't get us to the point where we can deduce a causal link between the two variables. I should be clear about that. But it gets us to a point where we can speak very confidently about associations. So speaking of our independence and controls, I've already discussed how our EU proximity variable works. We've added to this an EU dummy. There's a very simple reason for doing this. We want to make sure that when we're measuring an effect of EU accession, we're not actually also measuring the effect of EU accession criteria. So we need to distinguish these two effects. So one is the hurdle you have to jump in order to be a member. The other is the effect of the process. We need to know what the coefficient of both of these effects is at the same time. In order to make sure we have a full suite of controls, we've also added things like regulatory quality scores from the World Governance Indicators dataset. We've also added some of the hard data that are inputs into the Economic Freedom of the World indices, and also created instruments that should be causally linked to accession, but not causally linked to economic freedom. So, for instance, physical distance from the nearest EU capital, or EU Economic Intelligence Unit scores on electoral pluralism, political culture, and civil liberties. And finally, to explore specifically the way in which economic freedom has interacted with the recent crisis, we introduce a dummy for the crisis years of 2008 to 2013, and also a dummy for Eurozone members. We did seriously consider the idea of adding a dummy for countries in post-socialist tradition. Now, this was a massive, transition. This was a massive trend towards liberalization for much of Eastern Europe, and so we felt it was very important they be included in this study. Unfortunately, due to the design of our models, this variable ended up being rejected by the models themselves. Basically, most of the information in there was already included in all of the other inputs that went into our regressions. So, following this very long kind of methodological introduction, which I hope was not too boring for people, I can take you straight into the results themselves. The results come in two flavors. We've got results in relation to the Economic Freedom of the World Index, the top line measurement of economic freedom in general. And then we also have the exact same results, but in relation to sub-indices of the Economic Freedom of the World Index. So specifically on topics such as regulation or protection of property rights. So we'll start with the top line, with index level relationships. Now I'm flashing this in front of you very quickly. We're not really going to get very meaningful discussion out of going number by number. But one thing you will notice, remember, a negative sign is actually a good thing. It means that something contributes to a smaller freedom gap. This model is actually reasonably good in terms of the amount of variance that it can explain. This actually gets cut off at the bottom of my screen, but our best specifications actually can account for about 46% of all variance in economic freedom. So not half bad. And what do the results tell us? Well, the results basically tell us in a nutshell that, and any way you cut these results, they tell you roughly the same thing, that proximity to EU membership is associated with a shrinking freedom gap. So, EU accession, broadly speaking, is a good thing if you are interested in promoting economic freedom. And this is an effect that can't be reduced to just, for instance, the hurdle represented by accession criteria. The way to understand this distinction is, ask the question of, is the process of accession something that causes economic freedom, or is it something that just rewards greater economic freedom? So this is what we're controlling for here. And what we found is that you can't reduce the effect that we're finding to a reward mechanism. There is actually something that happens during accession that is transformative. Now, I'm using more causal language than I should, so please forgive me for that. The finding is not causal, but I think you get the distinction between the two effects that we're trying to tease out. We also find that the effect of increasing economic freedom with EU accession cannot be reduced simply to improvements in domestic regulatory quality. So we've added quality of regulation as an explanatory variable, and it doesn't make this effect disappear. The other thing that we found, and which is important, I think, for follow-on studies, is that any way you cut it, there is a significant correlation between economic growth and the crisis era as well, and the freedom gap. Basically, shrinking economies also are correlated with less economically liberal governance. Now, that's quite important when you try to attribute changes to economic freedom to different factors. I think future studies need to make more of this finding and make sure that they account for it. Now, the second layer of our analysis relates to channel level relationships, as I like to call them. So this is where we break down the effect of EU accession into the particular sub-indices of the Economic Freedom of the World Index. As a reminder, these are the 5 domains on the right. And so when we basically reran the same analysis 5 times to make sure that we've captured the effect at the level of each individual EFW domain. So we ran one for size of government, one for legal system, one for sound money, one for freedom to trade. And we found the following things. First of all, before we launch into the results themselves, I think it's important to appreciate that these sub-index scores are much, much more variable than the top-level index. So their standard deviations are twice as big. And what that means is it's actually a lot harder to find significant effects purely by the design of the study. It's got nothing to do with the reality on the ground. It's just statistically much more difficult to find significant effects. The second thing that we found was that there was a very, very big difference in the impact of the EU hurdle, basically of the variable of EU membership taken as itself. And finally, that some of our controls had to be reinterpreted. So for instance, quality of regulation in this context meant something different than if we applied it to a regression of the overall top-level index. Now again, lots of methodological detail here, for which I'm grateful for your patience, but I can take you straight to our results. Now, one thing you'll see here, if you look at the R-square values at the bottom, is that these regressions are a lot weaker. This is primarily because of the greater variance of these sub-index scores. So it's just harder to explain the changes than it was for the top-level index. And you can see a very big difference when we run these regressions with and without an EU membership dummy. So proximity to the EU is an independent variable in both cases, but its effects reduce dramatically once you introduce EU membership as a dummy. Now, there is an interpretation for that. The way to interpret this is to say that most of the effect of the individual channels of liberalization is attributable to the accession criteria as opposed to the process of accession. So it's all about the hurdle you have to clear as opposed to the transformative nature of EU accession. So there are strong correlations with quality of regulation, moderation of currency and interest rate manipulation, increasing effectiveness of the legal system, protection of property rights. But as far as we can tell in this analysis, they are more associated with the accession criteria, the hurdle you have to jump before you join, as opposed to the process, the evolution of a country as it goes through the accession pipeline. Now, when we look at the effects of the accession process itself, then it is freedom to trade internationally that is the main liberalization channel in a country's relationship with the EU. And it's the only one that we can reliably show right now is activated by the accession process, not by the criteria of membership. We also found some very challenging findings with regards to Eurozone membership. So what you will see in our analysis is that we're finding that Eurozone membership is positively associated with greater fiscal assertiveness, with a bigger state, effectively. And it's hard not to attribute that finding to the fact that these countries have lost monetary policy levers, which are crucial for other countries in managing things like economic crises. But even outside of a crisis, that also happens. So key finding here is that those countries within the EU that have joined the Eurozone and have given up monetary levers become more fiscally assertive as a result, which shouldn't be really surprising. And what we also find is that it's interesting there that it is mostly the EU and not Eurozone membership that is best correlated with things like sound money. Now, that to me was quite surprising. You would expect that sound money is really about monetary policy, but actually EU accession involves a stabilization process in terms of interest rates and price levels, and it seems to us that this is what is causing this effect. So effectively, sound money benefits from the EU accession process more than it does from Eurozone membership, which I'm sure is not what the architects of the euro had in mind. Now, this concludes the discussion of our actual findings, but I guess, bearing in mind that this is a research project and we want to make sure that others can build on it going forward, I would point to 4 takeaways for researchers. Really important to note here, and really important to the interpretation of this study, is this is still not designed as a study that can establish causal links. And it's actually very hard to do this using just the materials available to researchers. It's also important to appreciate that, really most of the interesting part of studies like this is to analyze the channels through which liberalization works. And it's hard to do when your data is noisy. Now, that's no fault of, people like the Fraser Institute who build the indices, but I think researchers can actually work with that data better if they use things like principal components analysis to create more solid variables that are less noisy. I think I've already covered this once by now, but it's really important when looking at economic freedom indices to tease out the mechanical effects of drops in GDP, so that we don't confound our analyses with the effects of economic crises. And then also to not just look into effects of EU accession, for instance, on liberalism, but also the trade-offs that it introduced. See, for instance, the effects we found with regards to Eurozone membership. So much further study is needed in that direction. Now, at this point, I think it's sensible for me to stop and for us to turn the floor over to our additional speakers and to Q&A. But thank you all very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mano, very much. Very interesting findings indeed, especially this clear path that the closer to the EU, the smaller the gap becomes, and this Eurozone effect that you measured, it's really, really interesting. We are going to discuss later on, I hope, in depth more about it. So let me give the floor to Giorgio Vernoni, our counterpart from Italy. Hello, Giorgio. Giorgio is also he is going to give us the Italian aspect, and he is a member of the study committee at the Centro di Ricerca e Documentazione Luigi Einaudi, if I pronounce it well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so welcome.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Yes, I will present the contribution of the Centro Einaudi to this very interesting publication, also on behalf of my colleague Angela De Martis, who could not attend the event, but sends you her best regards. And I will also propose you during the presentation some questions that arise from our work that could be discussed later in the panel session. As some of you already know, the Centro is not new to the topic of economic freedom because it has been for a long time the Italian partner of the Fraser Institute for the annual update of the Economic Freedom of the World report. Let's move to the presentation. Can you see it? Okay. In fact, for this reason, our paper starts with a presentation and a comment of the evolution of the Fraser's Economic Freedom Index in Italy in the last 4 years. The idea was to highlight some relevant events, both at national and European level, and to analyze the trend of the index and its main components in relation to these events. In particular, we identified the accession to the single currency in 1999 as a cathartic moment, just as important as the accession to the Union. Actually, my personal opinion, this event is probably even more relevant because it represents, from an historical point of view, the huge transfer of powers to non-national institutions in the history of modern state, as you know. The results are summarized in this chart. First, as you can see, there is a clear correlation between the EFW summary index and its main components and the accession to the euro in 1999. This is not a big surprise, as we know that some of the EFW indicators correspond quite precisely to the objectives set by the admission process to the Eurozone. Think in particular of the sound money indicator, which considers price stability and exchange rates, as Emmanuel Schizas was saying a few moments ago. But it's also interesting to observe that the post-entry phase of the single currency shows a substantial stabilization of the indicators and actually a modest downward trend, particularly in two areas remaining under the control of the national institutional system, namely the size of government and the efficiency of the legal system, that are two long-term Italian problems. On the other hand, the areas largely conditioned by the EU institution, international trade and monetary policy are stable but not improving, while the quality of regulation indicator has been growing steadily thanks, to make an example, to the streamlining of banking and finance law, again under European direction. From these conclusions arise the first two questions that we would like to propose you also for the discussion. The first one is, what can be the causes of the trend stabilization following the accession to the single currency? And the second is, do we observe this stabilization only in Italy or also in other European countries? That is to say, is this a national or a European matter? Actually, the answer to the second question is yes. We observe exactly the same trend also in France, Germany, and Spain, the other three major European countries. Of course, there is a difference in Germany, considering that the mark was, for the euro, the reference currency. So the trend is different at the beginning, but then follows the same path from 2000 onwards. What can be the causes? This is the first question. What can be the causes of the trend stabilization following the accession to the single currency? The answers could be many, also because there are lots of not observed and not observable factors through the existing tools, but three of them could be the following. The first one, the EU has already reached a high level of economic freedom. Secondly, it could be recession, the global financial crisis, the current pandemic crisis, that by reducing economic base could affect economic freedom. In fact, economic freedom, as we know, needs a dynamic social and economic environment to develop. Polarization and divergences at the subnational level. Well, I'm not sure about the first option. The second could be relevant, and the third is actually unexplored. For this reason, in our chapter, the second part is dedicated to introduce the ILERI. The ILERI is the Index of Economic Freedom of the Italian region. It's an experimental tool developed by the Centro Einaudi to measure economic freedom and analyze some of the aspects of the economic performance at the regional level. It compiles data from 2 decades on a set of 11 weighted areas measured through 38 official indicators of the National Institute of Statistics, ISTAT. This tool was clearly inspired by the Fraser Institute methodology, but it includes a different, also wider range of indicators, and therefore cannot be directly compared with the EFW index, in which most of the components are only available at the national level, and only in some cases can be indirectly estimated at the local level for proxy and outcome indicators. Let's see some examples of these proxy and outcome indicators. For example, we consider trade balance at the regional level that can be connected to the freedom to trade. Then we consider the public sector expenditure that can be connected to the size of government. We consider the credit risk that in some way can be connected to some money. And then birth rate of enterprises that could be connected to starting a business. So this is the idea. And there are other 30 indicators that form the 11 areas of the methodology. What are the conclusions? The main findings. The main findings is one. The first one is that we observe huge and widening regional disparities. This is the result, general ranking of ILERI in 2018. And you see very huge differences between Emilia-Romagna, which is the region in the north of the country, and Calabria, which is a region in the south of the country. So the first conclusion and the first finding is strong regional disparities. And the second conclusion is that there are also increasing differences at different speeds in the evolution of economic freedom at the regional level. And some of them are very well known and represent the historical gap between North and South. But also we observed, in particular analyzing the data before the global financial crisis and then after the global financial crisis, new gaps not between North and South, but between West and East, with a concentration of resources on the axis between Milan and Rome. So these are the main findings of the ILERI, among others. What are the messages that we can draw from this experience? Actually, there are two messages that I didn't have enough time to write it down, and I'll do it at the end of this beautiful event when I'll send you the final version of our presentation. But in any case, the first message is that regional difference matter, evolve and could have effects on the overall economic freedom of a country, and then should be included in the picture. This point, in our opinion, is even more important in the European Union that has placed the cohesion among regions at the center of its strategies. For this reason, the issue deserves further investigation. There is a second conclusion, a second message that refers about actually the concept of economic freedom. In fact, ILERI uses a wider concept of economic freedom that gives more space also to socioeconomic indicators. For example, indicators that refer to labor market functioning, because we think that also the definition of economic freedom should be updated and conceptualized in the 21st century from a definition that gives much space to I would say, the freedom of the enterprise, and also give more space to the freedom of the individuals. This is the message that we want to propose to you from the experience of the ILERI and our thoughts about economic freedom in Europe. That's all for me. Finally, I would like to thank ΚΕΦίΜ for this very good, positive partnership. This was for us, in fact, the first experience, the first project, full project as affiliate members to the European Liberal Forum. It's been very positive. And secondly, I would also like to thank the ELF Secretariat, the European Liberal Forum Secretariat, for actually creating this opportunity, because they were very attentive about our contents and experience, and they proposed us partnership. So thank again for the opportunity, and I look forward to discussing with you these results in the past session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Giorgio. Okay. Thank you very much for vividly showing us the importance of the regional aspect of the freedom aspect of the freedom indicator there. So, having seen the results of the research, we all noticed about the Freedom Index of the Fraser Institute that the research is based. So we're very honored today to have with us Fred McMahon to discuss about it. So thank you very much for joining us today for this discussion. And we will be glad to listen to your point and the Fraser Institute point on this research that was just presented. Mr. McMahon, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored to have this opportunity. And let me compliment ΚΕΦίΜ for organizing this terrific and particularly pertinent event right now, and also compliment the authors of the report, both generally and from Italy, for a very, very important report, which actually puts facts and research on the table. I must say, my experience in discussing the EU with anti-EU people is encountering more of a temper tantrum than an actual analysis of the benefits of the EU. Giorgio, before I forget, if you could send me your thoughts on the individual versus business aspects of economic freedom, I would appreciate it. Very much like to look at that. I mean, my sense is the business aspects are the individual aspects, but you may have some other insights there that I'm missing. I was particularly impressed by the improvements in the regulation and rule of law. These are the most difficult areas to change in economic freedom. In fact, our research suggests that the rule of law and much of regulation is a stationary point econometrically. That means if a good government comes in and improves the rule of law, it soon settles back down to where it was. If a bad government comes in and causes deterioration, it soon moves back up to where it was. So if there's a permanent change related to the EU membership, that is spectacular. Unless the improvement in monetary policy is also very important, but there's been a global increase in monetary policy, in the soundness of monetary policy. On size of government, I'd like to ask a couple questions. Size of government increases after or during a session. Is that increase in size of government in any way related to the improvements in rule of law and regulation? One would not think so. Rule of law and regulation are not hugely expensive things, but perhaps there is something going on there. What your research shows about the improvements leading up to a session but not following it, I think obviously highlights a weakness in the EU process. You have all the hammers prior to a session, and then because of the structure of the EU, nothing really to bang on after the accession, as the current crisis with Hungary and Poland shows. So some sort of reform would be necessary to keep the EU on track. If there are no enforcement mechanisms, you could see a splintering of the good results down the road. And in relation to that, I'd like to note that, at least anecdotally, one hears that many governments and leaders of government prior to accession make an argument something like this: God, I hate doing this. This is really awful. It's going to destroy, it's going to do great damage to our country, but I have no choice because the EU is forcing me to do it. And behind closed doors, they're going, thank God the EU is forcing us to do this. But when that pressure is relieved after a session, I wonder if this is responsible for some of the backtracking. The reforms have never really been sold to the government, and there's always been immense pressure against them. And again, Poland and Hungary and the rule of law are interesting examples, but not unique. Finally, there was some discussion of what happens to economic freedom post-crisis. I did a little bit of work on this, not sophisticated work, but what I found is after a financial crisis, economic freedom declines. And that's true whether it's the Great Recession, the Nordic financial crises, the Latin American financial crises, or the rolling financial crises in the United States in the 1980s. In all cases, or almost all cases, there was an immediate decline in economic freedom, and then an increase thereafter as people balanced out. That's particularly noticeable in the Nordic area, but also in Latin America and the Asian crisis and so on. However, a non-financial crisis, a political crisis, where there's only one really good example of that, and it may not be an example which we can draw from, the Arab Spring crisis, economic freedom declined in almost all Arab countries after the Arab Spring crisis. So improvements after financial economic crisis, deterioration after a political crisis. So those are my thoughts. And once again, thank you for a terrific program and terrific report.
Thank you, Fred, so much. It's very interesting to notice that after financial crisis, economic freedom declines all over time and all over the world, and also that political crisis example that you brought on Arab Spring case. So
yes, but remember, after that decline, economic freedom increases.
Yes, jump again up. So we would like to have the comment from George Pagoulatos, who is a professor of European politics and economy at the Athens University of Economics and Business. And he's also a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges, and the Director General at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, ELIAMEC, which is a major think tank in Greece on leading European and foreign policy think tank. So, Mr. Pagoulatos, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for including me in this excellent circle of people to discuss this fine paper, which is rigorous. It was very well presented. It is honest. It is modest, in, among others, admitting that it is very difficult to establish causal links. After all, social science and reality, even more so, is a fuzzy affair. It is not a counterintuitive finding that the European Union is correlated with economic freedom. I don't think that anyone would be surprised with this finding, except for ideological fundamentalists, either of the type who regard the European Union as a socialist leviathan, or of the type who regard the European Union as a free-for-all, laissez-faire, neoliberal wet dream. I think this is a very straightforward finding, and it is very well established in that the European Union, by way of an accession process, by way of a conditionality, and by way of a regulatory acquis and a rule of law framework, increases economic freedom, because the European Union has been based fundamentally on the pillar of a common market, of a single market, upon which the other pillars of further political integration, monetary integration, economic integration, and further regulation were built. So yes, it does increase economic freedom, but this also depends on where you come from. So it increases economic freedom if you come from Eastern Europe, not necessarily as a result of European accession, but as a result of market transition. And it also increases economic freedom if you come from Southern Europe, where corporatist regimes give way to a process of marketization, market liberalization, and government reform, which is very much driven by the European Union. Now, the second point I wish to make is that this paper helps us understand and remember some of the main functions of the European Union. Because what we see in this paper is the fact that the European Union operates as a regulatory blueprint. It produces regulation, which, for that matter, spans beyond its borders, has very significant extraterritorial power in it, but this is not something that we need to discuss now. It is an anchor of stabilization, especially for the countries that are acceding from the periphery. And both Greece and Italy, as presented by Giorgio, have been subject to this force of stabilization. And in the same way, if one takes a kind of a political economy perspective, it is also a kind of the ultimate mast on which Ulysses is tying himself to avoid the Sirens. In the way, it's the absolute self-binding process, and what Mr. McMahon mentioned as the kind of the scapegoating function of the European Union. It's a very convenient scapegoat for governments to do reforms that they would otherwise be reluctant to do for fear of political cost. And all these things, of course, are very good. And of course, we are reminded that the drivers of this process are trade and the legal system and the protection of human rights. And of course, it is also in the monetary field, the kind of the effort to avoid beggar thy neighbor devaluations, which was the main driver towards monetary integration. And of course, within this single market, the effort to establish a level playing field, which is one of the main functions of the European Union operating as a regulatory system. Now, that said, I would like to make a further remark that the European Union is not just about economic freedom, is not just about a regulatory state that regulatory system rather, that operates just in order to enforce economic freedom and protection of property rights. It is also a system of several functions that are not entirely market liberal in their logic. It is a function of regional integration. Regional policy has been one of the fundamental tenets of the Treaty of Rome. It is the operation of a social market economy of a German type, if I may put it schematically, in which, in a way by which the market operates through a very strict protection of competition, because it is perceived that protection of competition ensures economic competitiveness abroad, internationally, and this is very much the rationale under which the European Commission has operated as the ultimate regulator, but it is also a system that cohabits with government intervention at the national level by way of social market intervention and by way of social protection. And the European Union has been a project of Adam Smith abroad and within, in terms of establishing a free trade area and then a single market, etc., but also a project of Keynes at home at the time when it started, back in the 50s, 60s, and up to the 70s. And of course, this also helps us understand why we have this, no, it's not a paradox, it's a research question that was posed on the size of government increasing, and therefore we see a stability of the trend towards greater economic freedom. My explanation, on top of what has already been proposed, is that these Keynesian states that run into a stagflationary crisis in the 70s were left with high levels of legacy debt in the 80s, and then in the 90s, these large levels of legacy debt in conditions of relative economic stagnation, at least in the first half of the 90s, combined with the high interest rates, at least in the beginning of the 90s, were transformed into large government sectors. And then, of course, we have the two waves of the crisis. The crisis of 2008, which has been mentioned, and of course, the even larger wave of the crisis that we are now experiencing, of the pandemic crisis. And this brings me to another remark, that you kind of have approached the subject matter in a way of a linear progression, asking yourselves whether this linear progression leads to more or less economic freedom. I would propose a progress in cycles. The European Union and the European political economy in general over the last 70 years has gone through different cycles. And these cycles generate responses that are highly coordinated with each other between member states, which inevitably affect the overall response of the European Union and the overall balance between public and private, social and market, government and the market, if you like. So we were in a cycle of economic liberalization, marketization, privatization in the 80s and up to the 90s. And then this was compounded by macroeconomic stabilization in order to qualify for EMU accession, which you have very well described. But then after the 2008 crisis, it's a different ball game, because governments respond to crisis through government expansion, even inevitably as a result of the economy shrinking, the denominator shrinking, and therefore the government size in the economy increasing, even if the response is not as counter-cyclical as a kind of an orthodox Keynesian would suggest. And if we look at that today, this response is even more pronounced. It is, if you look at it strictly, the European Union today is a project that is moving away from economic freedom, because there is an increasing role of the government in the economy, and there is an increasingly expansionary response, both in the regulatory and in the fiscal policy realm. Now, that's, and to reach my final point, that to me, and I guess this is where my approach probably slightly parts, normatively speaking, and I'm sort of the odd one out in this group. For me, this is not a bad thing. If I would be looking at a guiding question for this project, my question would not be whether the European Union produces more economic freedom, but whether economic freedom produces more economic prosperity, or, if you like, happiness. And I'm putting it in, provocatively in this fuzzy kind of a kumbaya type way. Because I want to denote the fact that we are entering globally, in Europe, nationally, throughout the developed, but not only the developed world, a time when the importance of preserving public goods, global and European public goods, acquires a much higher priority than it did before. And the sense that we are operating within markets that are free enough, but require a more effective regulation in order to preserve these public goods and in order to avert market failures, which have undertaken cross-border dimensions, is growing. And it is impossible to address, for example, the problem of climate change without a very penetrating type of regulatory intervention at the global level, which inevitably distorts market efficiency, inevitably encroaches on market and economic freedom. And it is impossible to respond to an economic crisis such as the one we had in 2008, but even more so such as the COVID-19 crisis, without further government expansion. And of course, this is a wave that gives its way, and I fully agree with what's been said, to a process, to a trajectory towards economic liberalization, towards a steady state of more economic freedom. But at the time of crisis, the European Union or the European economies at both national and EU level need to respond with greater government expansion. This is what they're doing, and I think that they're wise enough to be doing so. So thank you very much, and thanks for allowing me this comment.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's very interesting. It's very interesting how we can connect the beginning of your comments to the ending. The fact that you said about scapegoating the EU and how can this connect, and if it does connect, to the happiness aspect you brought afterwards. So if we have policy goals achieved through a scapegoating process, how these goals to practically add up to the happiness, to the overall happiness or well-being of the European people. It's a very interesting discussion that we are going to have a lot about that, especially after this pandemic, I suppose. And having said that, I welcome to our panel Miranda Xafa, our esteemed friend and CEO of the EF Consulting. She's a senior scholar at the Center for International Governance Innovation, the former member of the board of the IMF and member of ΚΕΦίΜ's academic board as well. So Miranda, welcome. We would very much like to listen to your comment on this research presented today by our colleagues here.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to comment on this useful study of the impact of EU accession on the economic freedom of member states. Using empirical analysis, this very well presented study confirms that the process of EU accession is associated with increases in economic freedom. As George just said, this result is hardly surprising, as Europe's identity and its self-perception have been built on liberal democratic institutions and values, but it's good to have independent confirmation of that through econometric analysis. As discussed in the paper, EU membership increases economic freedom in a number of ways. First, by improving regulatory, legal, and administrative practices, but also by reducing trade barriers and by increasing monetary stability, especially for euro area members, for whom lower inflation and interest rates are a prerequisite for joining the common currency. Countries with open and competitive markets have higher standards of living than those that are heavily regulated, as the Fraser Institute's Index of Economic Freedom clearly and consistently has demonstrated over time. Opinion polls confirm that EU citizens recognize that EU membership is beneficial. Of course, there are the Eurosceptics who criticize the EU not just along a sort of north-south divide, but also on its immigration policies and on its supranationalism, as the Brexit vote clearly demonstrated. During the recent euro area crisis, the EU generally promoted a free market agenda through the conditionality it imposed on the countries that requested its financial assistance, and that includes Greece, of course. But the one instance I can think of where the opposite is true is the demand by some European governments that Ireland raise its corporate tax rate as part of its adjustment program back in 2010. Ireland has a corporate tax rate of just 12.5%, which is less than half of what some other much bigger euro area countries have. And of course, we all know that taxation remains a national competence in the EU, and decisions on tax matters at the European Council require unanimity. But many governments object to the uneven tax playing field, which obviously favors low tax jurisdictions such as Ireland, and they hope to harmonize rates across the EU. On the other hand, however, Ireland and other countries considers that its relatively low tax rate is a key ingredient of its economic success. The irony in this is that according to OECD data, Ireland collects substantially more corporate tax revenue as a percent of GDP than Germany or France, which were the countries that insisted that Ireland should reduce its corporate tax rate as a matter of leveling the playing field. And I have here the numbers. I looked them up both for back in 2010 when this issue first arose, and it has resurfaced since, but also for the latest data that I could find on the OECD website, which are 2017 data. So the latest data show that Ireland collects 3.1% of GDP in corporate taxes versus 2% for Germany and 2.3% for France. So this strengthens the case for tax harmonization, if ever it happens, to converge toward the lower rates currently in effect in the EU, rather than toward the higher rates. At least after the pandemic, during which the expansion in the size of government will hopefully be temporary. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's an interesting discussion, how countries reach towards a goal, if any, at any level of these common goals of European policies. So, having heard all your interesting comments, and before going back to our main researchers, Emmanuel Schizas and Giorgio Vernoni, I would like, starting with Manos, to recap this discussion and also try to give some answers to some of the questions that we have from our audience here. So, Mano, we have a question specifically for you. We also have one for you, Giorgio, later on. But to you, Manos, there is a question asking, there is someone asking that some academic literature proposes a reconstruction of the Economic Freedom Index without the size of government. I suppose this question also it goes to Fred as well, if he wants to add a comment. So they say that is the size of government in EU a determinant for more or less economic freedom, or it does not really matter? We have tackled it a little bit, but if you have something more to say and also comment.
Yes, so I think I can sympathize with that demand only to the extent that there are just mechanical effects of things like financial crises in the way the indices get calculated. So, for instance, the moment GDP falls dramatically and government spending fails to respond exactly in kind, which most governments would not do for fear of exacerbating a crisis, then mechanically your indices of economic freedom will deteriorate. I mean, there are reasonably easy fixes to that. You can take trend levels, you can take, moving averages of GDP or whatever. So, there are methodological tweaks that can be made there without removing the size of government from the index. I would not support removing the size of government from the index. Countries in which, let's say, employment by the government is the only game in town are substantially less free economically. That is almost trivial. So I wouldn't support taking this out. I would certainly, without having spent a lot of time working on the indices, I can certainly see the case for methodological tweaks that normalize kind of the movements of GDP for the purpose of these calculations.
Yeah. Fred, you would like to add something? Yeah, I see you.
Sure, very, very quickly. I agree with most of what Emmanuel just said, and like the idea of looking at the fix. The prime reason that people give for taking size of government out of the index is that, unlike all the other areas, size of government does not necessarily correlate with prosperity. In fact, Wagner's law, the law of a 19th century German economist, was that as countries grow richer, governments grow bigger. So prosperity itself may cause governments to grow richer. That said, the reason I agree with what Emmanuel is saying is this is not an index to measure the foundations of economic growth. It happens to do that fairly well, but that's not the purpose. It's a measure of economic freedom. And for the very reasons Emmanuel said, you're actually measuring economic freedom. Big government limits it by expropriating your property, by squeezing space for free exchange and so on.
Yeah, thank you. There is also someone else asking from our audience that to our researchers, now that you have measured this index of freedom to the assessing countries, which of the now assessing countries is closer to the EU economic framework in terms of economic freedom and robust economy? We have now Serbia, Turkey, and North Macedonia. Have you seen, or can you recall something from what you measured and rate these three countries accordingly? Do you have any data at hand?
I think we will have to leave that to Konstantinos and Mara to come back with in chat. Incendiary comment. I really wish I could respond in real time. Obviously, some countries undergoing the accession process are stalled in that situation. Like we were quite upfront in that. So countries like Turkey, for instance, are candidates. But realistically, if you look at how the EU institutions are dealing with their candidacy, it's a stillborn candidacy at this point. So I would rule that one out. Not for kind of nationalistic or kind of ideological reasons, but because practically it's not going anywhere. Which leaves us with two others. Given North Macedonia has only just started down the route, I think by elimination you'd have to favor Serbia there. But in terms of raw numbers, I'll leave that to my colleagues to respond in chat.
Yeah, thank you. Giorgio, we have one for you, and it has to do with the ILERI index, the index measuring the economic freedom in the Italian regions. And the question is the ILERI index an index which can be exported and used in other countries besides Italy? What's your experience? What can you say about it? Can you unmute your microphone, please? Sorry, can you unmute?
No, it's a very useful question, and also helped me to anticipate a thing that I intended to say. And yes, definitely, because the ILERI uses 38 indicators that are released by the National Institute of Statistics in Italy, and that could be also be found in other countries. That's in fact our idea. We intended to present the ILERI in this European framework because we would like to develop this experience, this experiment also at the international level. And we think that the European Liberal Forum could be the right place to do such a thing. So that's precisely our intention. This could become, to scale up the idea of ILERI at European level. And of course, it would require a redesign and in order to find the same information and comparable information at European level, but that's exactly our intention, to develop ILERI at European level with probably, if we manage to do it, with a European Liberal Forum project.
Okay, thank you. And there is another one, and the question is, which are the most obvious disparities in the European economies? Have something picked out in the European economies, not only the ascending countries, but what you measured in the economic freedom index that you put in time frame there? Is there that pops out as a case that would have an interest in terms of political decisions to be discussed there?
Actually, we didn't get so deep in the difference between the four countries. What we wanted to show is that the four biggest European countries have made the same path, have had a similar evolution throughout the last 40 years. So that was our intention. We have not articulated the analysis at the level of the 5 subcomponents or the 5 main components that generate the economic freedom of the world summary index. So not in this moment, we are not able to answer this question precisely.
And we also haven't done this, just to add to Giorgio's response, we also haven't done this. And the way you would approach it would not be in terms of disparities, because you have to account for where people started, right? So you would probably account for divergence in trends, which is the more kind of pertinent measure. That's something we can definitely look at, come back to, but we haven't done it for this study.
There is also another question, that's my question. Okay, I take the privilege of moderating now. And I have been working in Serbia for a couple of years in the accession project, the Serbian accession project, and I was in parliament, and what people said there very much struck to me in terms of what Mano said in the beginning, that freedom comes from the accession criteria themselves mostly or mainly, rather than from the process of acceding in the EU. And I can verify that because you had the chapters of the EU accession process ticked, every chapter, every prerequisite ticked in the country to be entering, in Serbia in this case, to be entering the EU. But what people there said, that process is like super urgent procedures in the parliament, which are not considered to be liberal procedures, or lack of consultation, or this squeezing too many regulations in few and much less time than usually used to produce regulations. That's an aspect that they consider to be rather illiberate. although the result was a path, a movement towards more liberal results. So it was contradicting the results to the process. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Shall I start then? I think others will want to weigh in on this. So I think there's a difference between reforms and ownership of reforms, and this is something, obviously, speaking also from a Greek perspective, was a very painful lesson of the whole period from 2010 onwards. So one of the key risks of anything to do with the EU, and it's kind of the flip side of the scapegoating point that Fred made, is this idea that you can have compliance without ownership. And the moment you do that, and in fact, the necessity of transposing EU regulations, sometimes with very short deadlines, leads you down that path of saying, we have to comply as opposed to we have to internalize. And so these are two separate processes. A compliance with or a transposition of EU law is a legal and technical process, whereas ownership of reforms is a political process. And the EU can force you to go through the first, and it can't force you to go through the latter. In fact, I'm not quite sure how the latter comes about. It's not my area of expertise, but I'm sure there are researchers, perhaps even on this panel, who know this better. So the problem is, if you have a big gap between ownership and technical compliance, then resentment arises. And you don't need to go to accession countries for that. You can go to the UK. The UK was one of the most compliant EU member states in terms of kind of infraction proceedings, in terms of did it transpose law correctly. It was actually a star pupil. The gap between ownership and compliance, though, was widening, and it led to what it led. And maybe it'll work out for them, but in the meantime, as a process of kind of EU integration, it wasn't a very good outcome.
Very, very, very nice. And I think that this report that you drafted can be a very useful tool to merging, to using it politically speaking, to give more acceptance for the people of the EU countries and the EU ascending countries to be accepting and having more ownership to the reforms. Tools like that showing that freedom comes with entering the EU, I suppose. So is there any question, if you have any questions, you can.
Could I just back up Emmanuel's point, because I think that's profoundly important. And let me give you an example from somewhere else in the world. Free market reforms were imposed on Chile. Chileans, the government took ownership of them, but Chileans never did. And that left the whole reform process immensely vulnerable. Research that we participated in shows that the support for free markets amongst people in Chile is amongst the lowest in the world, despite all the benefits that free markets have brought to Chile. So I think Emmanuel makes an extremely important point that these reforms have to be explained and sold to the people. Otherwise, you'll get the Chilean response, the Polish response, and the Hungarian response. A very key point.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Thank you. Is anyone else? Let me just check on Facebook. Do we have any other question there? We have no other questions as far as I can see. So thank you, everyone. You can find the report as well on the Facebook page and on the ELF's page. And it was a very nice discussion, very enlightening for all of us. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank to all our esteemed panelists and all the people that stayed up at 8:30 or later at other countries to join us and listen to this lively and nice discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a good night. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.